You didn't notice it at first. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where everything collapsed and revealed itself to you. It was quieter than that. Subtle. Almost polite. It started with a decision. Maybe something small. What to say. What to post. What to believe about someone. What to feel about yourself. And in that moment, it felt like it came from you. Your thoughts. Your will. Your choice. But what if it didn't? What if that decision wasn't as independent as you think? Think about the last time you felt betrayed. Not necessarily by someone else, but by an outcome. Something didn't go the way you expected. Someone didn't respond the way you predicted. A situation slipped out of your control. That moment, that sharp, uncomfortable realization, wasn't just about what happened. It was about what you thought would happen. Because deep down, you believed you understood the pattern. You believed you could anticipate the reaction. You believed you had control. And then reality broke that illusion. But here's the part most people never question. Where did that expectation come from? Why were you so certain? Why did it feel so natural to assume you knew how things would unfold? Because your mind is not just reacting to the world, it is predicting it. And those predictions are not random. They are built. Conditioned, reinforced over time through repetition, experience, and subtle influence. From the way you were raised, to the content you consume, to the people you surround yourself with, to the fears you avoid and the desires you chase. All of it shapes how you think. All of it shapes how you decide. All of it shapes you. And the most dangerous part? It feels like freedom. You wake up, you think your thoughts, you make your choices, and you assume they belong to you. But what if they are simply the result of patterns you've memorized? Patterns you didn't consciously choose. Patterns that can be studied, predicted, used. You are not as unpredictable as you believe. In fact, most people aren't. They follow emotional loops. They respond to familiar triggers. They seek validation in predictable ways. They avoid discomfort in consistent patterns. They call it personality. But often, it's programming. And once someone understands your patterns, they don't need to control you directly. They just need to position the right stimulus at the right time. A message, a tone, a reaction, a silence. And suddenly, you move, you respond, you feel. Not because you chose to, but because it was expected. Because it was predictable. And predictability is not harmless. It is exposure. Because if someone can predict how you will react, they can influence how you feel. If they can influence how you feel, they can influence how you act. And if they can influence how you act, they can control the outcome of your life without ever touching you. That's the level most people never reach. Not because it's hidden, but because it's uncomfortable. It challenges something fundamental, your identity. Because you don't just believe you make choices, you believe those choices define you. So what happens when those choices aren't entirely yours? What happens when your reactions can be mapped? Your fears anticipated, your desires triggered, your behavior predicted. It creates a quiet kind of tension, the kind you can't easily explain, a feeling that something is slightly off, but you can't quite identify what it is. You start questioning things you never questioned before. Why did I react like that? Why did I say that? Why did that affect me so much? And slowly, a realization begins to form. You are not losing control, you are realizing you never had it, not in the way you thought. Because control was never about making decisions. It was about understanding what drives them. And most people never go that deep. They stay at the surface, reacting, repeating, believing they are in charge, while operating within invisible boundaries. Boundaries shaped by habit, by emotion, by expectation, by influence. And the more predictable those boundaries become, the easier they are to navigate by others, the easier they are to use. This is why some people always seem to know what to say to you, why certain words affect you more than they should, why specific situations trigger the same emotional responses over and over again. It's not coincidence, it's pattern recognition. And someone, somewhere, is always paying attention, not necessarily with malicious intent. Sometimes it's subtle. Social dynamics, cultural norms, unspoken expectations. But the mechanism is the same. Predictability creates leverage, and leverage creates power. This is why you've felt manipulated before, even if you couldn't prove it. Why certain interactions left you drained, confused, slightly off balance, because something inside you recognized the pattern being used, even if your conscious mind didn't. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. You begin to notice how people test reactions, how they adjust their behavior based on your responses, how they learn what triggers you, what motivates you, what controls you. And the more consistent you are, the easier it becomes. You become readable, transparent, predictable. And in a world where influence is subtle and constant, that is a vulnerability most people never realize they have. Because predictability feels safe, it feels stable, it feels like identity. But it is also exposure, because anything that can be anticipated can be prepared for, and anything that can be prepared for can be controlled. So the question isn't whether you are being influenced. You are. Everyone is. The real question is, how predictable are you? How easy is it to anticipate your reaction? How often do you respond the same way, to the same triggers? And more importantly, who benefits from that predictability? Because once you start asking that question, everything begins to shift. You start to see patterns where you didn't before. You start to question impulses that once felt automatic. You start to realize that what you thought was you might just be a collection of learned responses. And that realization is uncomfortable. It creates resistance, doubt, even denial. Because if your reactions are predictable, then your identity is not as solid as you believed. And if your identity is not solid, then it can be influenced, reshaped, redirected. And that's where the real tension begins. Not in the outside world, but within you. Because now, you're faced with a choice. Ignore it and continue operating as you always have. Or confront it and begin to understand the mechanisms that shape your behavior. But understand this, once you start seeing your own patterns, you also start seeing how others see you. Not as a mystery, not as something unpredictable or complex, but as something that can be studied, something that can be anticipated, something that can be influenced. And that realization changes everything. Because now, control is no longer about what you do. It's about what others expect you to do, and whether or not you fulfill that expectation. Predictability is not comfort, it is exposure. And exposure is the beginning of vulnerability. So the next time you feel certain about how you'll react, pause. Ask yourself a simple question. Is this truly my choice, or just a pattern I've repeated so many times it feels like one? Because the moment you start questioning that is the moment the illusion begins to break. And once it breaks, you can never go back to seeing yourself the same way again. You think you make decisions in the moment, that you observe, analyze, and then choose. But most of what you call decision is actually recognition. Recognition of patterns you've seen before. Patterns your brain has quietly stored, categorized, and prepared for long before you were even aware of them. Your mind doesn't like uncertainty. It was never designed to. Uncertainty is expensive. It requires energy, attention, and time. So your brain does something efficient. It builds shortcuts, mental frameworks that allow you to respond quickly without having to rethink everything from scratch. These shortcuts feel like intuition, But they are often just memory in disguise. You walk into a room, and within seconds, you've already formed impressions. Who feels trustworthy? Who feels distant? Who feels dominant? Who feels safe? You didn't consciously calculate that. You recognized it. Or at least, you believed you did. Because what you're actually recognizing are fragments, expressions, tones, postures, micro-behaviors that resemble something you've encountered before. And your brain fills in the rest, not based on truth, but based on familiarity. This is how predictability is built. Not through conscious repetition, but through unconscious reinforcement. Every time you react to something in a similar way, you strengthen a pathway. Every time you feel a familiar emotion in a familiar situation, you deepen the association. Over time, these pathways become automatic, effortless, invisible, and that's when they become powerful. Because anything that runs automatically can be anticipated. You don't wake up and decide how to feel about everything from zero. You rely on pre-built responses. Emotional templates, behavioral scripts. You call it who you are. But in many ways, it's just what you've practiced the most. Think about how quickly you reach for your phone when you feel bored, or how certain words instantly trigger irritation, or how approval from specific people feels disproportionately important. These are not random reactions. They are loops, dopamine-driven cycles that reward familiarity and discourage deviation. Your brain learns what feels good, what feels safe, what feels validating, and then it pushes you toward those experiences again and again. Not because they are always right, but because they are known, and what is known feels controllable, even when it's not. This is where predictability becomes deeply embedded, not just in behavior, but in desire. You don't just act in patterns. You want in patterns. You crave in patterns. You fear in patterns. And once your desires and fears become predictable, you become predictable. This is why two completely different people, from different backgrounds, cultures, and environments, can react almost identically to certain stimuli. Rejection, praise, authority, belonging. These are universal triggers, because beneath all the complexity, human psychology follows structure. There are biases that shape perception. One of the most powerful is confirmation bias, the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms what you already believe. It sounds harmless, but it quietly locks you into a loop. Because once you believe something, your brain begins filtering reality to protect that belief. You notice what supports it. You ignore what challenges it. And over time, your version of reality becomes narrower, more predictable, easier to map. You think you're forming independent opinions, but often, you're just reinforcing existing ones. And anyone who understands what you already believe can predict how you'll respond to new information. They don't need to change your mind directly. They just need to present something that fits within the structure you've already accepted. That's influence at its most efficient. Not forcing change, but guiding it through familiarity. Then there's social conditioning. From the moment you're born, you're immersed in systems that shape behavior. Family expectations, cultural norms, educational structures, social hierarchies. You learn what is acceptable, what is rewarded, what is punished. And slowly, without realizing it, you adjust. Not because you are weak, but because you are human, because belonging has always been tied to survival. So you adapt, you align, you mirror. And over time, those adaptations become identity. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If your identity is shaped by external patterns, then it can also be predicted by them. This doesn't mean you are not unique. It means your uniqueness exists within constraints. Within patterns that are shared, repeated, and understood. You are a variation, but not a mystery. And that realization creates tension, because you want to believe you are unpredictable, independent, unmapped. But the more you observe yourself honestly, the more patterns you begin to see. The same reactions, the same emotional cycles, the same decisions under similar conditions. You start to notice how your environment influences you more than you thought, how your mood shifts based on subtle cues, how your opinions are shaped by what you consume. And suddenly, you don't just feel like a person, you feel like a system with inputs and outputs, triggers and responses, variables and patterns. And systems can be studied, anticipated, influenced. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to matter. This is not about turning you into something mechanical. It's about recognizing that your behavior follows structure, and structure creates predictability, even in moments that feel spontaneous, even in decisions that feel deeply personal, because spontaneity is often just a faster version of the same process, a rapid recognition of patterns, followed by an automatic response. You don't react to the world, you react to patterns you've memorized. And once that idea settles in, it changes how you see everything. It changes how you interpret your past, how you understand your present, and how you approach your future. Because now, every reaction becomes a clue. Every emotion becomes data. Every decision becomes something you can question. Not to paralyze yourself, but to understand yourself. Because the more aware you become of your own patterns, the less control they have over you. But at the same time, the more you realize how easily those patterns can be used by others. Not always with bad intentions. Sometimes it's subtle. A conversation where someone knows exactly what to say to get a reaction. A message designed to trigger curiosity, fear, or desire. A system that rewards certain behaviors while quietly discouraging others. This is how influence operates in the real world. Not through force, but through alignment with existing patterns. And the more predictable those patterns are, the more effective the influence becomes. This is why marketing works, why propaganda spreads, why certain ideas gain traction while others disappear. Because they don't fight your psychology, they use it. They position themselves within your existing beliefs, your existing desires, your existing fears. And once they fit, they move through you effortlessly. You accept them, defend them, repeat them, not because you were forced to, but because they felt right. Familiar, expected. And that's the point where predictability becomes invisible. Because when something aligns perfectly with your internal patterns, you don't question it, you trust it, even when you shouldn't. So take a moment. Think about your last major decision. Not just what you chose, but why you chose it. Was it driven by logic or by comfort? By clarity or by familiarity? When was the last time you made a decision that wasn't influenced by fear, desire, or habit? It's a difficult question, because most decisions are influenced by at least one of those forces, and those forces are predictable. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. But it also means something important. If you don't understand your patterns, someone else will. And if someone else understands your patterns, they don't need to control you directly. They just need to anticipate you. And anticipation is the foundation of influence. So the real question is not whether you are predictable. You are. The question is, are you aware of how predictable you are? Because awareness is the first disruption. The first break in the pattern. The first moment where you stop reacting automatically and start observing intentionally. And in that space, between stimulus and response, something powerful begins to form. Not control, not yet, but the possibility of it. You've started to notice your own patterns, the reactions that repeat, the emotions that return on cue, the decisions that feel different, but somehow lead to the same outcomes. At first, it feels personal, internal, like something within you needs to be understood. But then a more unsettling realization begins to emerge. What if those patterns are not only yours? What if they are shared, anticipated, and quietly used? Because the moment you step outside your own mind and look at the systems around you, something becomes clear. Influence is not random. It is designed, carefully structured, layered, refined over time, not to control you directly, but to guide you without resistance. The world does not need to force you into decisions. It only needs to shape the environment in which those decisions feel natural. And once something feels natural, you stop questioning it. This is the architecture of influence. It doesn't look like control. It feels like choice. Think about the stories you believe, not just the obvious ones, but the deeper narratives, the ideas about success, about failure, about what makes someone valuable, about what kind of life is worth living. You didn't invent those ideas from nothing. They were introduced to you, repeated, reinforced through culture, media, education, conversation, and over time, they stopped feeling like external suggestions and started feeling like internal truths. That's how narratives work. They don't demand belief, they create familiarity, and familiarity becomes acceptance. This is why two people can look at the same situation and interpret it completely differently. Not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because they are operating under different narratives, different internal frameworks that shape how they process reality. And once you understand someone's narrative, you don't need to argue with them. You can predict them, guide them, influence them, because you know what feels true to them. And truth, in many cases, is less about facts and more about alignment with existing belief. This is how large-scale influence operates, not through force, but through narrative consistency. You've seen it before. Ideas repeated until they feel undeniable. Messages framed in ways that trigger emotional agreement before logical analysis even begins. Concepts simplified, packaged, and delivered in forms that are easy to accept and difficult to question. Not because they are necessarily false, but because they are structured to feel right. And once something feels right, it spreads. You repeat it, you defend it, you integrate it into your identity. And that's when influence becomes self-sustaining. Because now, it doesn't need to be imposed. It lives inside you. But influence doesn't stop at narratives. It extends into authority. From a young age, you are taught to recognize certain figures as credible. Teachers, experts, leaders, institutions. You learn to trust their words, not just because of what they say, but because of who they are positioned to be. Authority is not just about knowledge, it's about perception. And perception is powerful. Because when you perceive someone as an authority, your resistance lowers. You listen differently. You question less. You accept more. Not consciously, but instinctively. This is why two identical statements can be received in completely different ways depending on who delivers them. One is ignored, the other is believed. Because influence is not just about content, it's about context, about positioning, about perceived credibility. And once that credibility is established, influence becomes effortless. This is not always malicious. Authority can guide, educate, and stabilize. But it also has the capacity to shape belief without resistance, to direct thought without confrontation, to influence behavior without appearing to do so. And most people never notice it happening, because it feels normal, expected, even necessary. Then there's emotional architecture, the way messages are designed not just to inform, but to trigger fear, hope, anger, belonging. These are not accidental elements. They are deliberate entry points into your decision-making process, because emotion moves faster than logic. It bypasses analysis. It creates urgency. And once emotion is activated, Your ability to evaluate objectively begins to narrow. You don't think as broadly. You don't question as deeply. You react. And reaction is predictable. This is why emotionally charged content spreads faster, why certain headlines capture attention instantly, why some messages stay with you long after you've encountered them. Because they didn't just inform you, they affected you. And once something affects you, it becomes part of your internal pattern system. It shapes how you respond next time. It influences future decisions, without needing to be repeated in the same way. This is how influence compounds. Quietly, gradually, systematically, across time. And the more layers it builds, the less visible it becomes. You don't see the structure. You only experience the result. A thought that feels like yours. A belief that feels obvious. A reaction that feels justified. But beneath that experience, there is design. Not always by a single person or entity, but by systems. Cultural systems, social systems, information systems, all interacting, overlapping, reinforcing each other, creating an environment where certain behaviors are encouraged and others are discouraged, not through force, but through feedback. Reward, punishment, visibility, silence. You post something that aligns with dominant narratives, it gets attention. You express something outside those patterns, it gets ignored, challenged, or dismissed. Over time, you learn, you adjust, you refine your behavior. Not because someone told you to, but because the system responded in a certain way. And you adapted. That adaptation is influence. Not imposed, but absorbed. And the more you adapt, the more predictable you become within that system. You begin to operate within its boundaries without even noticing them. You think you are expressing yourself, but often you are expressing what fits, what works, what is accepted. And slowly, subtly, your range narrows. Not in an obvious way, but in a way that feels natural, efficient, safe. This is where influence becomes most powerful, not when it controls you, but when it defines the limits of what you consider possible. Because once your perception of possibility is shaped, your choices follow automatically. You don't need to be forced into a decision if all available options already lead in the same direction. And that is the highest form of control, the most refined, the most invisible, the most effective. The most powerful control is the one you don't recognize. Because you won't resist it. You won't question it. You won't even see it as control. You'll see it as reality, as truth, as your own conclusion. And that's where the real shift begins. Because once you understand that influence is structured, not random, you start looking differently at everything. At conversations, at information, at authority, at your own reactions. You start asking questions that most people never ask. Why does this feel convincing? Why does this trigger me? Why does this seem obvious? And those questions disrupt the structure. Even slightly, because influence depends on flow, on continuity, on the absence of resistance. And the moment you introduce awareness, even a small amount, the system changes. Not completely, but enough. Enough to create space, enough to pause, enough to see that what once felt natural might have been designed to feel that way. And in that realization, there is something powerful. Not complete freedom, not yet, but distance. Distance from automatic acceptance. Distance from unconscious alignment. Distance from patterns that once controlled you without your knowledge. And in that distance, you begin to see the architecture. Not perfectly, but clearly enough to understand one thing. You were never just reacting to the world. You were responding to a structure. A structure that learned you as much as you learned it. At some point, this stops being about the world and starts becoming about you. Not the version of you that you present, but the one operating underneath. The one making decisions before you even realize a decision is being made. Because once you begin to understand influence, patterns, systems, there's a question that becomes impossible to ignore. Where do you end? And where does conditioning begin? And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because it's easy to analyze systems, easy to question media, easy to point at authority and say, that's influence. It's much harder to look inward and recognize how much of that influence has already shaped you, not just your behavior, but your identity. You like to believe your identity is solid, that it's something you built, something stable, something real. But what if parts of it were never chosen? What if they were adopted, slowly, quietly, through repetition and reinforcement? Your opinions, your preferences, even your sense of self-worth. How much of that came from you, and how much came from what you were rewarded for? Because from the very beginning, you were taught what to value. Approval, acceptance, belonging. You learned that certain behaviors brought praise and others brought rejection, and without realizing it, you adjusted. Not once, but continuously. You refined how you speak, how you act, how you present yourself. Not necessarily to deceive, but to fit, to be understood, to be accepted. And that desire, that need to be understood, feels human, natural, but it also creates a vulnerability, because the moment your identity depends on how others perceive you, you are no longer fully in control of it. You are negotiating it, constantly, subtly. You say things not just because they are true, but because they will be received well. You hold back thoughts, not because they are wrong, but because they might create distance. You adjust your personality depending on the room, not because you are fake, but because you are adapting. And adaptation, over time, becomes identity. But here's the part most people avoid confronting. If your identity shifts based on external feedback, then it can be shaped by it, guided by it, controlled by it, not forcefully, but gradually, almost invisibly. You are easier to influence than you think, not because you lack intelligence, but because you are human, because you want connection, because you want to belong, because rejection feels like loss, and loss is something your mind is wired to avoid. So you adjust again and again, until the line between who you are and who you've learned to be becomes difficult to see. This is where emotional dependence begins to form, not in obvious ways, but in subtle reliance. On validation, on approval, on recognition. You tell yourself you don't need it, that you are independent. But notice how your mood shifts based on how others respond to you, how a single comment can linger in your mind longer than it should, how silence from the right person can feel louder than words. These are not random reactions. They are indicators, signals that part of your identity exists outside of you, and anything that exists outside of you can be influenced from the outside. This is why certain people hold more power over you than they should. Not because they control you directly, but because they influence how you see yourself. Their approval feels like confirmation. Their rejection feels like doubt. And without realizing it, you begin to align your behavior with their expectations. Not consciously, but predictably. Your need to be understood is what makes you predictable. Because when you want to be understood, you reveal patterns. You repeat behaviors that have worked before. You communicate in ways that ensure acceptance, and those patterns can be learned, anticipated, used. Not always with bad intentions, but the effect is the same. You become readable, and readability is the first step toward influence. Then, there's the fear of rejection, a force so subtle, yet so powerful, that it shapes decisions before you even recognize it. You don't always think, I'm afraid of being rejected, but you feel it, in hesitation, in overthinking, in the way you second-guess yourself before speaking. You calculate reactions. You imagine outcomes. You adjust accordingly, all to avoid discomfort, all to maintain connection. But in doing so, you limit yourself, not because someone forced you to, but because you anticipated the consequence. And anticipation is where control begins. Because if your behavior is shaped by what you think others will think, then others don't need to control you. You're already doing it for them. This is how influence becomes internalized, how control becomes self-imposed. You restrict yourself, filter yourself, modify yourself, all in the name of belonging. And over time, that restriction feels normal. Even necessary. You forget what it feels like to act without considering perception, to choose without calculating approval, to exist without performing, because performance has become part of your identity. But pause for a moment, strip everything back, remove the audience, remove the expectations, remove the feedback, and ask yourself something simple. If no one approved of your choices, would you still make them? It's not an easy question, because it forces you to separate your true desires from the ones shaped by acceptance. It forces you to confront the possibility that some of what you want is not entirely yours. And that realization can feel destabilizing, because identity is supposed to feel solid, certain, defined. But what you're beginning to see is that it's more fluid than you thought, more influenced, more shaped by forces you didn't fully notice. And that doesn't make you weak. It makes you aware, because now, instead of blindly operating within those patterns, you can start to see them. The moments where you seek validation, the moments where you avoid discomfort, the moments where you adjust yourself to fit expectations. And once you see them, you have a choice. Not an easy one, but a real one. Continue operating as you always have, or begin questioning the parts of your identity that feel automatic. Because identity is not just what you are, it's what you repeat. And anything you repeat without awareness can be influenced without resistance. So this is where the shift begins. Not in the world around you, but within you, in the quiet recognition that some of your reactions are not as independent as they feel, that some of your desires are not as original as they seem, that some of your fears are not entirely your own. And that realization is not meant to break you. It's meant to expose something, the space between who you are and who you've been shaped to be. And in that space, there is discomfort. But there is also something else, something far more important, the possibility of becoming someone who is no longer defined by unconscious patterns, but by conscious choice. Once you begin to see your patterns and the systems built around them, something shifts, not all at once, but enough to create distance. Distance from automatic reactions, distance from expectations, distance from the version of yourself that once felt fixed, but now feels observed. And in that distance, a question emerges. If predictability is vulnerability, then what is the opposite? Not randomness, not chaos, but something far more precise. Unpredictability. Not the kind that is reckless or impulsive, but the kind that is controlled, intentional, difficult to map. Because true unpredictability is not about acting without thought. It's about thinking beyond patterns. It's about refusing to be confined by expectations, both your own and others. You see, manipulation depends on certainty. It depends on knowing how you will respond, what will trigger you, what will move you, what will stop you. And once those variables are known, influence becomes efficient, almost effortless. But remove that certainty, and everything changes, because now there is hesitation, uncertainty, calculation. The person trying to influence you can no longer rely on patterns. They can no longer predict the outcome. And without prediction, control weakens. This is why unpredictability is not just a trait, it is a form of psychological strength. When people can't predict you, they can't control you. But understand this carefully. Unpredictability is not about being inconsistent. It's not about saying one thing today and another tomorrow. It's not about confusing others for the sake of it. That's instability. And instability is just another pattern. True unpredictability is rooted in awareness. It comes from understanding your own tendencies and choosing not to be ruled by them. It's the ability to pause when a reaction feels automatic, to question when a response feels expected, to step outside the script even when it feels uncomfortable. Because most people live inside scripts. Social scripts, emotional scripts, behavioral scripts. They follow them without realizing it. They respond how they're supposed to respond. They react how they've always reacted. And that consistency makes them easy to read. But the moment you begin to break those scripts, even slightly, you create space. Space that others can't easily navigate. Space that forces them to reconsider, to adjust, to respect boundaries they didn't notice before. Because unpredictability introduces friction, and friction disrupts control. Think about moments in history where power shifted unexpectedly, not through force, but through refusal to follow the expected path. Leaders who didn't respond the way they were supposed to. Movements that didn't behave the way they were predicted to behave. Individuals who made decisions that couldn't be easily categorized or anticipated. These moments weren't random. They were strategic. They were calculated disruptions of expectation. And that disruption changed outcomes, because when a system expects compliance and receives resistance, it has to adapt. When it expects silence and receives clarity, it has to respond differently. When it expects predictability and encounters independence, it loses efficiency, and efficiency is what influence depends on. But this doesn't only apply to large systems. It applies to your daily interactions, your relationships, your environment. Notice how people begin to form expectations about you, how they assume how you'll react, what you'll tolerate, what you'll accept, what you'll ignore. These expectations become the framework through which they interact with you, and if you consistently meet those expectations, they solidify. They become assumptions. And assumptions become leverage. Because once someone assumes your behavior, they begin to operate around it. They push where they know you won't resist. They rely on patterns they've seen before. They move with confidence because they believe they understand you. But the moment you step outside that expectation, even slightly, that confidence breaks. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to create uncertainty, enough to force recalibration, enough to shift the dynamic. Because unpredictability creates psychological distance. It separates you from automatic responses, from conditioned reactions, from the version of you that others think they know. And in that distance, you regain something. Not control over others, but control over yourself. You become less reactive, less readable, less influenced by immediate triggers, and more guided by conscious choice. This is where boundaries begin to strengthen, not through confrontation, but through unpredictability. Because when people can't predict what you'll accept, they become more careful, more respectful, more aware, not necessarily because they changed, but because the dynamic changed. Because now, you are no longer operating within a fixed pattern. You are no longer confirming their expectations. You are introducing uncertainty. And uncertainty demands attention. But there's a deeper layer to this. Unpredictability is not just about how others see you. It's about how you see yourself. Because as long as you believe you will always react the same way, you limit yourself. You become confined to your past behavior, your previous patterns, your familiar responses. But the moment you realize that you don't have to follow those patterns, that you can choose differently, even when it feels unnatural, something shifts internally. You stop identifying with your reactions and start observing them. You stop saying, "This is just how I am," and start asking, "Is this how I want to be?" And that question breaks predictability at its root, because now your behavior is no longer automatic. It's intentional. And intention is difficult to predict, not because it's random, but because it's flexible, adaptive, independent from past conditioning. This is what makes unpredictability powerful. It's not about being unreadable all the time. It's about not being locked into a single pattern, not being easily defined, not being reduced to a predictable set of responses, because once you are reduced, you are manageable. And once you are manageable, you are influenceable. But when you remain fluid, aware, intentional, you become something else, something harder to control, harder to anticipate, harder to limit. And that doesn't mean you become distant or disconnected. It means you become selective, deliberate. You choose when to respond, how to respond, whether to respond at all. You stop reacting out of habit and start acting out of awareness. And that difference changes everything, because the world around you hasn't changed. The systems are still there. The patterns still exist. The influence is still present. But your relationship to it is different. You are no longer moving automatically within it. You are navigating it consciously. And that is where real strength begins, not in controlling others, but in no longer being easily controlled. Because when people can't predict you, they can't control you. And when they can't control you, you begin to experience something most people rarely do. A sense of internal freedom, not absolute, but real. Because for the first time, your actions are not just responses, they are choices. And those choices are no longer limited by what is expected, but defined by what is understood. And that understanding is what separates those who are influenced from those who remain independent. There is a moment, almost invisible, where everything changes. Not outside you, inside you. It's the moment between feeling and reacting. Most people never notice it, because for them, emotion and action are the same thing. A feeling appears, and a response follows immediately. Anger becomes words. Fear becomes hesitation. Desire becomes impulse. It feels natural. But that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because if your emotions automatically dictate your actions, then your actions can be controlled simply by controlling your emotions. And emotions are the easiest entry point, not because they are weak, but because they are fast. Faster than logic, faster than reflection, faster than awareness. They bypass your analysis and move straight into behavior. And anyone who understands that doesn't need to argue with you. They just need to make you feel something. Fear, so you hesitate. Anger, so you react. Validation, so you comply. Desire, so you chase. These are not just emotions, they are levers, and most people are being moved by them without ever realizing it. Think about how quickly your state can change. One message, one comment, one unexpected reaction from someone you care about. Suddenly, your thoughts shift. Your focus narrows. Your behavior adjusts. You weren't forced. You were triggered. And the moment you are triggered, you become predictable again. Because emotional reactions follow patterns. If someone knows what angers you, they know how to provoke you. If they know what you fear, they know how to stop you. If they know what you crave, they know how to guide you. And most of this doesn't happen in obvious ways. It happens subtly, through tone, through timing, through suggestion, through absence, a delayed reply, a certain word choice, a carefully framed message. These are small things, but they carry emotional weight, and that weight shapes your response. This is why emotional mastery is not about suppression. It's about awareness. Because suppressing emotion doesn't remove, it hides it. And hidden emotions are even easier to manipulate, because you're no longer aware of them influencing you. You just feel off, reactive, uncertain, and in that state, you are even more predictable. So the goal is not to eliminate emotion, it's to separate it from immediate action. To create space, that same space you began to notice earlier, the space between stimulus and response, because in that space, you regain control, not over what you feel, but over what you do with it. And that distinction changes everything. You can feel anger without expressing it immediately. You can feel fear without obeying it. You can feel desire without chasing it blindly. That's not detachment from emotion. That's control over reaction. And control over reaction is what removes the leverage others have over you. Your emotions are real, but they are not always yours to trust. Not because they are false, but because they are influenced, shaped by your past, by your conditioning, by the environment around you. Sometimes, what you feel is a reflection of something external, not something true. And if you treat every emotion as a command, you surrender your control to whatever triggered it. This is why awareness is the first step. Noticing the emotion as it arises, labeling it, understanding where it might be coming from, not reacting immediately, but observing. It sounds simple, but it's not easy. Because your mind is trained to respond quickly, to resolve discomfort immediately, to act, but the moment you resist that urge even slightly, you disrupt the pattern, you slow the process, and in that slowing you gain clarity. You begin to see the difference between reaction and response. Reaction is automatic. Response is intentional. Reaction is driven by emotion. Response is guided by awareness. And most people live in reaction. They speak without thinking, decide without questioning, act without pausing, and because of that, they remain predictable. But when you begin to respond instead of react, you become something else. Less immediate, less readable, less controlled. This is where strategic silence comes in. Not as avoidance, but as power. Because silence breaks expectation. When someone expects a reaction and receives none, it creates uncertainty. It removes the feedback they rely on. It forces them to reconsider, to adjust, to question. Silence is not absence. It is strategy. It is the refusal to give others access to your immediate emotional state. The refusal to confirm their expectations. The refusal to be easily read. And in that refusal, you take back control. Not through confrontation, but through restraint. Because restraint is something most people don't practice. They feel, and they express. They are transparent in their reactions, and transparency makes them predictable. But when you become selective in what you reveal, when you choose when and how to respond, you create distance. And that distance protects you, not from emotion, but from manipulation. Then there's validation, one of the most subtle yet powerful emotional drivers. The need to feel seen, approved, recognized. It shapes more behavior than most people realize. You say things to be accepted. You do things to be appreciated. You adjust yourself to maintain approval. And over time, that external validation becomes a reference point, a guide, a measure of whether you are right. But the problem is, anything that validates you can also control you. Because if someone can give you validation, they can also withhold it. And that creates dependency, not obvious, but real. You begin to act in ways that maintain that validation, avoiding actions that might risk it, aligning with expectations, staying within boundaries that keep you accepted, and slowly, your behavior becomes shaped by something outside of you. This is why internal validation is essential. Not as arrogance, but a stability. The ability to evaluate yourself without relying entirely on external feedback. To know when you are aligned with your values, regardless of how others respond. That doesn't mean ignoring feedback. It means not being controlled by it, because when your sense of self is internal, it becomes harder to manipulate, harder to shift, harder to influence through emotional leverage. And this is where detachment begins. Not detachment from people, not detachment from life, but detachment from automatic emotional control. You still feel, you still care, you still experience, but you are no longer driven blindly by those experiences. You observe them, understand them, and choose your response. And that choice is where your power lies. Because once your reactions are no longer automatic, they are no longer predictable. And once they are no longer predictable, they are no longer easily influenced. You don't become emotionless. You become deliberate. You don't stop feeling. You stop being controlled by what you feel. And in that shift, there is something quiet, but powerful. A sense of stability, of clarity, of distance from the chaos that once dictated your actions. Because now, when something triggers you, you notice it. You pause, you decide. And that decision is yours. Not the result of a pattern, not the result of a trigger, but the result of awareness. And awareness is the beginning of freedom. After everything begins to fall apart, something unexpected happens. You don't disappear. You don't lose yourself completely. Instead, you are left with something quieter, something less defined. A space. And in that space, there is a choice. Because once you've seen the patterns, once you've recognized the influence, once you've questioned the identity you've been operating within, you can't go back to being unaware. But awareness alone is not enough. If all you do is deconstruct, you remain unstable, observing everything, trusting nothing, questioning endlessly. That's not freedom. That's fragmentation. So the next step is not to reject identity, but to rebuild it. Not based on what you've been conditioned to be, but based on what you consciously choose to become. And that begins with something simple, but rarely practiced. Defining your own values, not the ones you inherited, not the ones that were rewarded, but the ones that hold, even when no one is watching. Because most values are tested in silence, when there is no audience, no validation, no consequence except your own awareness. That's where clarity begins, not in what you say you believe, but in what you continue to choose when no one reinforces it. This is where mental independence starts to take form. Not as rebellion, not as rejection of everything external, but as filtration. The ability to engage with ideas without being absorbed by them, to listen without automatically agreeing, to observe without immediately reacting. You don't shut the world out, you just stop letting it define you. Because before, your identity was reactive, shaped by feedback, adjusted by perception. Now, it becomes selective, deliberate, grounded in something internal, and that internal foundation is what gives you stability. Not because it never changes, but because it changes by choice, not by pressure. This is where clarity of thought becomes essential. Because without clarity, you fall back into patterns, old habits, old reactions, old ways of thinking that feel familiar, even if they're limiting. Clarity is not about knowing everything. It's about knowing enough to question what doesn't align, to pause before accepting, to examine before integrating. It's a slower process, less efficient in the short term, but far more powerful in the long term. Because now, your thoughts are not just reactions, they are constructions, built consciously, refined over time, aligned with values you've actually chosen, and when your thoughts become intentional, your identity follows. But there's another layer to this. one that most people struggle with. Resistance to external validation, not rejection of it, but independence from it, because validation is not inherently negative. It becomes a problem when it becomes necessary. When your decisions depend on it, when your confidence relies on it, when your identity adjusts to maintain it, that's where influence regains its power. But when validation becomes optional, something changes. You can still receive it, appreciate it, but you are no longer guided by it. You no longer need approval to act, or reassurance to continue, or recognition to feel secure, because your reference point has shifted from external feedback to internal alignment. And that alignment is what makes your identity stable. Not rigid, not closed, but grounded. You begin to move differently, not in a way that seeks attention, but in a way that doesn't depend on it. You speak when it matters. You remain silent when it doesn't. You act based on understanding, not reaction. And over time, this creates something subtle, but powerful: consistency. Not the predictable kind, but the intentional kind. The kind that comes from knowing what you stand for, not from repeating what you've always done. Because now, your actions are not based on patterns, they are based on principles. And principles are much harder to manipulate, because they don't shift with pressure, they don't bend with approval, they don't disappear under discomfort. They remain, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's misunderstood, even when it's challenged. And that's what makes them powerful, because they are yours, not assigned, not inherited, not influenced without your awareness. Chosen, refined, maintained. This is where autonomy begins. Not isolation, not detachment from others, but independence within connection. The ability to engage with the world without losing yourself in it, to interact without being shaped unconsciously, to adapt without becoming dependent. And that balance is what most people never reach, because it requires awareness, discipline, patience, and a willingness to confront parts of yourself that are uncomfortable. But once you begin to build from this place, everything shifts. Your decisions become clearer. Your reactions become slower. Your presence becomes more stable. Not because you've eliminated uncertainty, but because you've stopped relying on it being resolved externally. You carry your own reference point, your own structure, your own understanding. And that changes how others interact with you, because now, you are not easily influenced by pressure, not easily moved by emotion, not easily shaped by expectation. You are still human, still capable of feeling, still capable of connection, but no longer dependent on it to define you. And in that state, there is a different kind of strength. Not loud, not aggressive, not dominant, but controlled, precise, stable. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to control others. You don't need to force outcomes, because you've shifted the focus from the external to the internal. You don't need to control others when you control yourself. And that control is not about restriction. It's about alignment, knowing what matters, acting accordingly, and remaining consistent, not because you have to, but because you choose to. And that choice is what rebuilds identity, not as something fixed, but as something conscious, something you carry, not something you perform. And once that identity is built, it becomes very difficult to break, because it's no longer dependent on the world around you. It exists within you. At the beginning, it felt like something was being taken from you. Control, certainty, identity, the realization that your thoughts, your reactions, even parts of your personality could be predicted, influenced, shaped. It didn't feel empowering. It felt destabilizing. But now, something else begins to emerge. Not loss, not confusion, but clarity. Because what once looked like control from the outside was never truly yours to begin with. And what you've been building quietly, step by step, is something far more stable. Not control over everything, but control over yourself. And that changes the entire equation. Because the goal was never to become untouchable, never to become cold, distant, or disconnected. That's not strength. That's avoidance. Real strength is something more precise, more grounded. It's the ability to remain aware, even when emotion rises, to remain intentional, even when pressure builds, to remain stable, even when the environment shifts. And that kind of stability cannot be easily broken. Because it doesn't depend on what happens around you. It comes from how you process what happens. This is the final shift. Not in behavior, but in identity. You no longer see yourself as someone reacting to the world. You see yourself as someone observing it, interpreting it, choosing how to engage with it. And that subtle shift changes everything. Because once you are no longer fully immersed in your reactions, you are no longer controlled by them. Once you are no longer dependent on validation, you are no longer guided by it. Once you are no longer confined by predictable patterns, you are no longer limited by them. This is what it means to become unbreakable. Not that nothing affects you, but that nothing defines you without your awareness. Not that you never feel pressure, but that pressure doesn't decide your response. Not that you never experience doubt, but that doubt doesn't control your direction. You become something different. Not rigid, not resistant, but stable, adaptable without losing yourself, engaged without being consumed, present without being predictable. And that presence carries a different kind of weight. Because people begin to notice something they can't quite explain. You don't react the way they expect. You don't follow the patterns they anticipate. You don't respond to pressure the same way others do. And that creates uncertainty. Not because you are trying to confuse anyone, but because you are no longer operating within fixed expectations. You are aware, deliberate, independent in your thinking. And that independence cannot be easily influenced. Because influence relies on familiarity, on patterns, on predictable reactions. And you have stepped outside of that. Not completely, but enough. Enough to create distance, enough to introduce unpredictability, enough to disrupt the mechanisms that once worked on you without resistance. And in that disruption, you gain something most people never fully experience. Freedom. Not absolute freedom, but internal freedom. The ability to choose your response, to define your actions, to align your behavior with your understanding, not with external pressure. And that freedom is what makes you difficult to control, difficult to influence, difficult to break. Because breaking someone requires leverage. It requires knowing where to apply pressure, what to target, what will trigger a reaction strong enough to disrupt them. But when your reactions are no longer automatic, that leverage disappears. When your identity is no longer dependent on external validation, that pressure weakens. When your behavior is no longer predictable, that strategy fails. And suddenly, you are no longer an easy system to navigate. You are no longer something that can be mapped and controlled through patterns. You are something else. Something more complex, more aware, more intentional. And that intention is what defines you now. Not your past patterns, not your conditioned responses, but your present awareness. The ability to see clearly, to choose carefully, to act deliberately. You are not here to be understood. You are here to understand not just the world around you, but yourself within it. Your patterns, your triggers, your tendencies. And the moment you understand those things, you are no longer controlled by them. You work with them. You navigate them. You decide when they apply and when they don't. And that decision is where your power lies. Because power is not dominance. It's not control over others. It's not the ability to manipulate or influence externally. Real power is internal. It's the ability to remain steady when everything around you is designed to move you, to remain clear when everything is trying to confuse you, to remain intentional when everything is pushing you toward reaction. And that kind of power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply exists in the way you think, in the way you respond, in the way you carry yourself through situations that once would have controlled you. The moment you stop being predictable, you start being powerful. Not because unpredictability makes you superior, but because it makes you free. Free from automatic patterns, free from unconscious influence, free from reactions that once defined your behavior. And in that freedom, you become something most people spend their entire lives trying to become, but never fully reach. Someone who is not easily shaped by the world, but understands it well enough to move within it, without losing themselves. So now, there's only one question left. Not about control, not about influence, not about the systems around you, but about you. If everything influencing you disappeared, every expectation, every pressure, every pattern you've learned to follow, who would you become? And more importantly, what would you choose to keep? Because that answer is where your true identity begins.